Andrew Walker was not an unfamiliar figure at Glencorse Barracks. At 30 years old, he had already spent more than a decade in the British Army, owning a reputation as a competent, if sometimes arrogant, firearms instructor. He had served 3 tours in Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles, gaining extensive combat experience but also enduring the psychological strain that such service inevitably imposed. Those who knew him described him as disciplined, meticulous, and highly skilled with weapons, but also prone to embellishment, boasting of exploits and feats that often strained credibility. Yet beneath the veneer of competence, Walker carried a burden. In the months leading up to the Glencorse Massacre, he had begun to unravel, plagued by a series of disciplinary penalties for lapses in performance. His commanding officers had grown frustrated with his increasingly erratic behavior. Reports described him as unreliable and prone to deception. Colleagues whispered about his growing arrogance, noting that he was quick to lie when confronted, often twisting events to suit his own narrative. Financial pressure compounded Walker's troubles. He was deeply in debt, owing £2,000 on a car and planning the purchase of another vehicle worth £8,500, an amount far beyond his official military pay. Friends and family had expressed concern about his tendency to live beyond his means, a habit that had grown dangerous when combined with his volatile temperament. The mounting stress of money problems, professional scrutiny, and personal dissatisfaction created a dangerous cocktail. Despite the outward appearance of normalcy, Walker's behavior in the days before January 17, 1985, foreshadowed the violence to come. He had gone absent without leave for 3 days, a fact that did not escape the notice of his superiors. By the morning of the massacre, he had carefully prepared for the operation that would shock Scotland and leave 3 men dead. Walker's plan relied on his intimate knowledge of army procedures. As a firearms instructor, he was well aware of which officers carried which weapons, when vehicles were scheduled to depart, and the exact route the payroll Land Rover would take. He signed out a Sterling submachine gun from the army, taking advantage of a minor loophole. Although soldiers were not supposed to keep live ammunition from firing range exercises, it was common knowledge that some did. Walker ensured he had enough rounds hidden for his deadly purpose. The target was both precise and audacious. The army vehicle carried not only 3 trained soldiers but also £19,000 in cash, funds earmarked for payroll. The route, schedule, and routine of these trips were widely known, creating an opportunity that Walker would exploit. Unlike a random robbery, this was a carefully orchestrated plan, designed to take advantage of trust, familiarity, and a lack of immediate suspicion. On the morning of January 17th, the 3 men departed Glencorse Barracks as usual, unaware that the danger lay within their own ranks. Major David Cunningham, the civilian paymaster, had only recently returned to the barracks after retiring from the Royal Pioneer Corps. He was meticulous, methodical, and carried the authority of his years of service. Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers, a seasoned soldier with extensive overseas experience, was responsible for maintaining the smooth operation of the payroll run. Private John Thompson, new to the unit and on his first assignment, had little reason to suspect betrayal. Walker positioned himself strategically, knowing precisely when and where the Land Rover would pass. Dressed in standard army uniform, he blended seamlessly with the surroundings, ensuring that any witnesses would assume he belonged there. A passerby later reported seeing a soldier walking near the abandoned vehicle at around 10:15 a.m., while another individual observed a man sprinting toward the main road, a figure matching Walker's description. The killings themselves were executed with chilling precision. Witnesses later described the scene at Longley Cottage as grotesque. Cunningham and Hoskers were positioned on the steps as if deliberately staged, while Thompson lay crumpled nearby. The meticulous nature of the execution, combined with Walker's intimate knowledge of military routines, suggested a premeditation that was both calculated and cold. Investigators quickly ruled out a terrorist attack. Although the IRA had been active in Britain and across Europe, their methods and armaments did not match the evidence. The bullets recovered were 9mm parabellum cartridges, standard issue for the British Army but not commonly used by the IRA at that time. Moreover, no organization claimed responsibility for the killings, further indicating a local perpetrator, someone with access, knowledge, and familiarity with army procedures. The forensic evidence was critical. Ballistic tests matched a bullet recovered from Hosker's shoulder to the Sterling submachine gun Walker had signed out that morning. Additional evidence, including witness testimony and his unexplained absence, reinforced the case. Authorities were convinced they were dealing with a premeditated act of murder and theft committed by a man intimately familiar with his victims' routines. Beyond the evidence, Walker's personal motives became clear during questioning. His mounting debts, desire for immediate cash, and apparent disregard for human life painted a portrait of a man willing to cross moral boundaries for personal gain. He fabricated alibis, initially blaming the IRA for the attack. Yet the physical evidence, combined with witness accounts, left investigators with little doubt. Walker had planned the killings down to the smallest detail, understanding both the timing and the route of the Land Rover. In the days following the massacre, law enforcement combed the area for clues. The £19,000 payroll was never recovered, fueling speculation that Walker had buried it somewhere in the Pentland Hills, intending to retrieve it after clearing suspicion. The meticulous nature of the crime suggested that he had considered every possibility, securing the vehicle, hiding the weapon, and creating an alibi that would deflect suspicion. Yet, in his haste, the icy roads had betrayed him, causing the Land Rover to slide into a ditch, a critical error that ultimately exposed him. Walker's arrest marked the beginning of a lengthy legal process. While awaiting trial, he reportedly assaulted a cellmate, an 18-year-old inmate named Andrew Iden. Iden claimed that Walker confessed in gruesome detail to the murders and threatened the safety of his family and friends. Allegedly, Walker coerced Iden into taking a letter from prison that attempted to shift blame to the IRA, a document later confiscated by authorities and used in court testimony. The story of Walker's life, background, and criminal planning provided a chilling insight into the psychology of the man who would commit one of Scotland's most notorious crimes in modern history. It revealed a combination of arrogance, desperation, and intimate knowledge of his environment that, when combined, had deadly consequences. Part of the horror of the Glencorse Massacre lay not only in the act itself but in the betrayal. 3 men, colleagues, and fellow soldiers, had unwittingly allowed one of their own to climb into the vehicle, trusting him entirely. That trust was shattered in the most violent way possible. The military and local community were left reeling. Questions abounded. How could such a meticulously planned crime be carried out without immediate detection? How could someone within the military exploit trust and procedure so effectively? And most importantly, could such an act have been prevented if warning signs, Walker's prior disciplinary issues, debts, and erratic behavior had been addressed? Investigators pieced together the morning of January 17th with painstaking detail. Walker had concealed his weapon under his coat, waited along the route, and positioned himself to exploit the routine and predictability of the payroll run. When the Land Rover approached, he revealed the submachine gun, forcing the driver and passengers into compliance. Each action was deliberate, each shot calculated. Even after killing his victims, he attempted to cover his tracks, arranging bodies and fleeing the scene to avoid immediate suspicion. Yet, as in many cases of overconfidence, the tiniest error proved fatal to his plan. The Land Rover sliding into a ditch created the chain of evidence that would ultimately lead to his arrest and conviction. The very traits that had enabled him to execute the crime, knowledge, skill, and planning, also carried the seeds of his downfall when confronted with the unpredictability of nature and human intervention. The morning of January 17, 1985, began like any other in the Pentland Hills of Midlothian, Scotland. The air was crisp and bitter, frost coating the rolling hills, and a pale winter sun barely pierced the heavy clouds. At Glencorse, preparations for the weekly payroll run proceeded with routine precision. Major David Cunningham, Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers, and Private John Thompson had no inkling that this day would end in tragedy. By 9:30 a.m., the trio departed the barracks in their Army Land Rover, a vehicle familiar to them all. Cunningham sat in the front passenger seat, overseeing the payroll funds, while Thompson, newly assigned and inexperienced, took the wheel. Hoskers, seated in the back, kept an eye on the canvas bag containing £19,000 intended for the soldiers stationed throughout the region. The short journey to the Royal Bank in Pennock took mere minutes, a routine they had completed countless times, but the precision of habit made them all the more vulnerable. At the bank, the transaction was brief. The trio collected the funds and began the return journey. Unknown to them, Andrew Walker, a firearms instructor at the barracks, had been lying in wait along their predictable route. Walker, 30 years old and a man known for both skill and arrogance, had meticulously prepared for this day. Financial pressures, mounting debts, and a growing sense of desperation had driven him to plan an act of betrayal and murder that would shock Scotland. Walker's uniform allowed him to blend in seamlessly with his surroundings. Observers would later recall seeing a soldier walking near the roadside, unaware of the sinister intentions that accompanied him. When the Land Rover approached, Walker revealed the submachine gun he had concealed under his coat, forcing compliance. His victims, trusting the familiar face and uniform, had little reason to suspect danger, an element that made the execution all the more chilling. The killings themselves were carried out with a cold, calculated precision. Hoskers, seated in the back, was the first to be shot. Walker fired 2 rounds into his chest, the violence of the act leaving the man slumped across the seat. Cunningham, in the front passenger seat, was killed with a single shot to the back of the head, a swift execution that left no room for survival. Private Thompson, the youngest and most inexperienced, was forced to continue driving, unaware that his own life would be extinguished moments later. Walker guided the Land Rover to a secluded location at Longley Cottage, a derelict stone building over a mile from the barracks. There, he ordered Thompson to remove the bodies of Cunningham and Hoskers from the vehicle. The young private, trembling and in shock, complied under threat of death. Walker arranged the 2 men on the steps, upright, as if to stage the scene with deliberate intent. Thompson was then executed with a single shot to the head, his life ending in the snow-covered courtyard. The brutality of the massacre left little doubt about Walker's intentions. He had exploited his position, knowledge, and the trust of his fellow soldiers to orchestrate a crime that was both personal and calculated. The stolen payroll, totaling £19,000, was never recovered, and authorities later surmised that Walker had buried it somewhere in the Pentland Hills, intending to retrieve it after suspicion had subsided. When the bodies were discovered, the scene was described as a bloodbath. Blood trailed from the vehicle to the cottage, frozen in beads along the snowy ground. Police officers, including PCs Bill Anderson and Doug G. Allen, followed the trail to Longley Cottage, encountering the horrifying tableau. Cunningham and Hoskers sat like bookends on the steps, while Thompson lay in a crumpled heap, a bullet wound visible through the back of his head. Anderson later recounted the chilling impact of seeing the scene for the first time, noting the surreal stillness and the eerie arrangement of the victims. The immediate aftermath involved a rapid response from law enforcement and military personnel. The barracks were locked down, and investigators meticulously documented the scene. Shell casings, vehicle placement, and witness testimony provided critical evidence. The pattern of 9mm parabellum cartridges, standard issue for the British Army but not commonly used by the IRA, pointed investigators toward an internal perpetrator. This detail, coupled with the absence of a claim from any terrorist organization, shifted the focus to someone with intimate knowledge of Army procedures and access to firearms. Witnesses played a key role in piecing together the events. One woman reported seeing a soldier walking near the abandoned Land Rover around 10:15 a.m., while a man parking nearby saw someone running toward the main road. The descriptions matched Walker: dark hair, clean-shaven, dressed in the olive-green uniform of the Glencorse Barracks regiments. Another witness near the bank observed 4 men in the Land Rover, suggesting that the killer had been picked up by the victims before the collection of the payroll. Forensic analysis became pivotal in linking Walker to the murders. Ballistics tests matched a bullet extracted from Hosker's shoulder to the Sterling submachine gun Walker had signed out that morning. Investigators also examined the firing pins and striations left on spent cartridges, confirming that the weapon had been used in the killings. Walker's absence from the barracks, combined with these forensic findings, provided the authorities with the necessary grounds to issue an arrest warrant. Walker's motive, upon investigation, became apparent. He was deeply in debt, living beyond his means, and facing disciplinary penalties that threatened his career. The lure of £19,000 in cash, combined with an opportunity to exploit his knowledge of army routines, presented a temptation he could not resist. His actions were premeditated, ruthless, and indicative of a man who prioritized personal gain over human life. The Glencorse Massacre sent shockwaves through the local community and the military establishment. Questions about trust, security, and protocol arose immediately. How could a soldier exploit his position so thoroughly? How had warning signs, disciplinary issues, financial stress, and erratic behavior gone unaddressed? The case highlighted vulnerabilities within military operations, emphasizing the need for strict oversight and accountability. As the investigation continued, police and military authorities worked in tandem to reconstruct the timeline. Interviews with soldiers, examination of sign-out sheets, and cross-referencing ballistic evidence narrowed the list of suspects. Walker's prior service in Northern Ireland, while demonstrating his combat experience, also revealed potential psychological strain that may have contributed to his decision-making. The meticulous nature of the killings, combined with Walker's knowledge and planning, underscored the premeditated aspect of the crime. He had considered multiple contingencies, concealing his weapon, staging the scene, and fleeing without detection. Yet, despite his careful planning, the icy roads betrayed him. The Land Rover sliding into a ditch created a visible trail, leading investigators directly to the scene and setting in motion the chain of events that would culminate in his capture. In the weeks following the massacre, law enforcement continued to gather evidence. The £19,000 payroll remained missing, adding a layer of mystery and fueling speculation about Walker's intentions and whereabouts. Witness accounts, forensic analysis, and Walker's own inconsistencies painted a clear picture of guilt. The investigation also shed light on the broader implications for Army security, demonstrating how internal knowledge could be exploited for criminal purposes. The discovery of the 3 soldiers' bodies at Longley Cottage on that frigid January morning sent shockwaves through Midlothian and beyond. Glenna Barracks, a place typically associated with discipline, camaraderie, and routine military procedure, was suddenly the scene of an unspeakable atrocity. The horror of the massacre, carried out on one of the coldest days of the year, was compounded by the intimate nature of the crime. One of their own had turned traitor. Investigators immediately began the painstaking process of reconstructing the events. PCs Bill Anderson and Doug G. Allen, the first officers on the scene, provided detailed accounts of what they had found. Anderson described the blooded Land Rover, seats saturated with gore and empty shell casings scattered across the vehicle's interior. The trail of blood leading from the vehicle to Longley Cottage painted a macabre path that investigators would follow with painstaking precision. The bodies' positions, the 2 senior soldiers upright on the steps and Thompson crumpled on the ground, suggested both premeditation and a disturbing desire to stage the crime scene. Early suspicion had naturally fallen on terrorist groups such as the Provisional Irish Republican Army (IRA), which was then in the midst of its violent campaign against British military targets. The IRA had a notorious record for assassinations and bombings, most famously the attempted assassination of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984. However, initial forensic analysis immediately raised doubts about a terrorist attack. The bullet casings recovered were 9mm parabellum rounds, standard issue for the British Army but rarely used by the IRA at that time. Moreover, no claim of responsibility came from any paramilitary group, suggesting that the perpetrator was someone with detailed knowledge of Army operations. Witness statements became central to narrowing down the suspect list. One woman reported seeing a man in uniform near the abandoned Land Rover at approximately 10:15 a.m., while a local man described seeing a soldier running toward the main road moments later. The descriptions, dark hair, clean-shaven, wearing an olive-green uniform matching the Glenna Barracks regiments, would soon prove crucial. Another witness near the bank observed 4 men in the Land Rover, indicating that the killer had gained the trust of the victims before the payroll collection. Investigators at Glenna Barracks meticulously reviewed the Army sign-out sheets, a procedure critical to understanding who had access to firearms on the morning of the murders. Soldiers were issued firearms only when on active duty, but could sign out additional weapons for authorized purposes, such as firing range practice. A detailed cross-check revealed a glaring discrepancy. Corporal Andrew Walker, a 30-year-old firearms instructor with over 12 years of service, had signed out a Sterling submachine gun that morning and was now missing. The weapon was later found to have been returned clean, but Walker himself was nowhere to be found. Ballistic analysis became the linchpin in linking Walker to the killings. Each firearm leaves distinctive marks on the bullets it fires, including barrel striations and firing pin impressions. A complete bullet retrieved from Hosker's shoulder was matched to the Sterling submachine gun Walker had signed out, providing the first concrete forensic link between him and the murders. Walker's absence, combined with witness statements and ballistic evidence, established a compelling case for his arrest. Walker's personal circumstances painted a picture of both motive and opportunity. He had served 3 tours in Northern Ireland, where combat experience and exposure to violence had shaped his skills and knowledge. Recently, however, he had accumulated significant debts, including £2,000 owed on a vehicle and plans to purchase another worth £8,500. His reputation among colleagues had begun to suffer. He was known to be unreliable, prone to exaggeration, and had received multiple disciplinary actions for poor performance. Financial desperation, combined with a sense of entitlement and skill with firearms, created the perfect storm that led to the massacre. 3 days after the killings, Walker returned to the barracks, attempting to blend in as though nothing had happened. He feigned ignorance, claiming no knowledge of the murders, and even suggested that the IRA might be responsible. Investigators, however, were unconvinced. Witness reports, forensic evidence, and inconsistencies in Walker's story quickly pointed to his involvement. The canvas bag containing £19,000 remained missing, further implicating him, as authorities surmised that he had hidden it somewhere in the Pentland Hills. Walker was officially arrested and charged with the triple murders. While awaiting trial, he exhibited further disturbing behavior. He allegedly assaulted his cellmate, 18-year-old Andrew Iden, in a violent outburst, threatening to kill Iden's family if he disclosed any information. Iden later testified that Walker confessed to the murders in grotesque detail, describing each execution and the planning that led up to it. Walker also attempted to manipulate Iden into carrying a letter that falsely implicated the IRA, which was later confiscated and presented as evidence in court. The legal proceedings that followed drew significant attention across Scotland. The trial was held at the High Court in Edinburgh, where Walker faced charges of 3 counts of murder, theft of the army payroll, and multiple counts of firearm offenses. His defense argued that he had been elsewhere during the murders and that the IRA was responsible for the crime. Walker's attempts to deflect blame and plant doubt in the investigation were ultimately unsuccessful, as forensic evidence and witness testimony painted a clear picture of guilt. Prosecutors detailed the events of January 17th with meticulous care, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime. They presented evidence of Walker's access to the Sterling submachine gun, the ballistic matches, and the sequence of killings at Longley Cottage. Witnesses recounted seeing a soldier near the crime scene, the movements of the Land Rover, and the trail of blood that led to the discovery of the bodies. The testimony of Andrew Iden, corroborated by forensic findings, further strengthened the prosecution's case. The psychological profile presented by experts highlighted Walker's combination of financial desperation, arrogance, and familiarity with firearms as key factors in the planning and execution of the massacre. The court examined his prior military service, disciplinary record, and financial situation to understand his motivations. His behavior demonstrated a chilling combination of calculated planning and callous disregard for human life. As the trial progressed, the nation followed every development with morbid fascination. Newspapers and television outlets reported extensively on the murders, the investigation, and the courtroom proceedings. Public shock was palpable. The idea that a trusted member of the army could orchestrate such a brutal act was nearly incomprehensible. Families of the victims, colleagues at the barracks, and the broader military community were left grappling with the enormity of the betrayal. The jury, after days of deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Walker's sentence was 30 years in prison, one of the longest ever handed down for a civilian-associated murder in modern Scottish history. The judge, in delivering the sentence, emphasized the premeditated and callous nature of the crime, noting the complete disregard for the lives of the victims. The case became a reference point in discussions about internal security, military oversight, and the psychological evaluation of armed personnel. In addition to the murder conviction, Walker's conduct in prison would later lead to further legal consequences. In 1987, he allegedly led a riot at Peterhead Prison, taking officers hostage and instigating a violent confrontation that required intervention by elite SAS units. For this, he received an additional 9-year sentence, reflecting a pattern of violent behavior and inability to adhere to societal norms even while incarcerated. The Glencorse Massacre, as it came to be known, remained a sobering example of the potential consequences when insider knowledge, desperation, and opportunity intersect. Walker's crimes left a lasting impact on the military community, highlighting vulnerabilities in payroll security, firearm access, and the psychological monitoring of personnel. The story became a cautionary tale, studied by military and law enforcement professionals alike, demonstrating the importance of vigilance and procedural safeguards. By the time Andrew Walker stood in the High Court in Edinburgh, the gravity of his crimes had already reverberated throughout Scotland. The Glencorse Massacre was no longer merely a military tragedy, it had become a national obsession. Newspapers detailed every known. The aftermath of the trial brought additional consequences for Walker. In 1987, while serving his sentence at Peterhead Prison, he was implicated in a violent prison riot. Inmates had taken control of a hall, held officers hostage, and engaged in prolonged violent acts. The elite SAS was deployed to end the siege, and Walker was subsequently charged with leading the uprising, receiving an additional 9-year sentence. These incidents reflected a continued pattern of violent behavior, reinforcing the perception that Walker remained a dangerous individual even in a controlled environment. For the families of the victims and the military community, the trial's conclusion did not erase the pain. Major Cunningham, Staff Sergeant Hoskers, and Private Thompson were commemorated for their service and sacrifice, with memorials and remembrance ceremonies held in their honor. The Glencorse Massacre became a case study in both military and civilian circles, illustrating the potential dangers posed by insider threats, the importance of procedural oversight, and the devastating consequences of financial desperation when combined with access to deadly weapons. After his conviction for the Glencorse Massacre in 1985, Andrew Walker was transferred to Peterhead Prison, located on Scotland's northeast coast. At the time, Peterhead was one of the country's most secure facilities, designed to contain high-risk offenders, including violent criminals and those with a history of organized crime. The prison's reputation for strict control and discipline made it an ideal place to house a man like Walker, whose actions demonstrated both premeditation and extreme violence. Upon arrival, Walker's initial period in the prison system was marked by tension and adjustment. Guards quickly recognized him as a high-risk inmate. His physical stature, combined with his military training and knowledge of weapons, made him potentially dangerous in the confined and volatile environment of the prison. Despite this, Walker maintained a calm, controlled exterior, drawing on his military discipline to navigate the early days of incarceration. However, it did not take long for his violent tendencies to resurface. By 1987, just 2 years into his sentence, Walker became a central figure in one of Scotland's most notorious prison disturbances. Inmates at Peterhead took advantage of overcrowding and lax supervision in certain areas to stage an uprising. During the riot, which lasted 5 days, officers were held hostage, and violence was rampant. Walker allegedly emerged as a leader among the prisoners, coordinating efforts, issuing threats, and directly participating in assaults. Among the hostages were officers Bill Florence and Jackie Stewart, who were subjected to prolonged intimidation, physical attacks, and psychological torment. Reports indicate that prisoners paraded Stewart across the prison roof, threatened him with fire, and deprived him of food and water. The elite SAS, Specialized Service, was eventually called in to resolve the siege. They executed a carefully planned assault on the prison wing controlled by the inmates, subduing Walker and the others without loss of life among the rescuers. Following the incident, Walker faced additional charges related to the riot. He was sentenced to 9 more years in prison for his role, a term which would later merge with his existing sentence for the Glencorse Massacre. This episode highlighted Walker's continued willingness to assert control through violence, even within a highly monitored and secure environment. Despite his notoriety, Walker remained an enigmatic figure in the prison system. Guards reported that he exhibited a dual nature, on one hand, disciplined, orderly, and methodical, on the other, capable of sudden, calculated acts of extreme aggression. He reportedly cultivated relationships with certain inmates, using manipulation and intimidation to maintain influence. It was during this time that speculation began circulating regarding the missing £19,000 army payroll, the sum that had motivated him to murder 3 men in the first place. The stolen payroll, believed to have been buried somewhere in the Pentland Hills, remained elusive. Prison investigators and law enforcement periodically attempted to locate the money, interviewing Walker extensively. Yet, he offered no confession about its location. Some theorized that he had intentionally buried the money in a remote location, planning to retrieve it upon release. Others suggested that he may have spent portions of it prior to his arrest, possibly on vehicles, gambling debts, or living expenses. Whatever the truth, the missing £19,000 became a permanent footnote in the story of the massacre, a tangible symbol of the greed and desperation that had led to 3 deaths. Walker's behavior in prison also reflected a disturbing lack of remorse. Colleagues who had known him during his military service noted that even after conviction, he rarely expressed regret or acknowledgement of the human cost of his actions. While some criminals develop a form of penitence when confronted with the weight of their deeds, Walker maintained a rational, almost detached view, focusing primarily on survival and strategic manipulation within the prison system. Psychologists who assessed him later suggested traits consistent with psychopathy, including superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, and calculated risk-taking. During his incarceration, Walker suffered both personal and physical setbacks. In 2009, he suffered a severe stroke that left him partially disabled. The stroke marked a dramatic shift in his circumstances, reducing his autonomy and rendering him dependent on medical care. 3 years later, in 2012, the Scottish authorities released him early on compassionate grounds, citing his diminished health and inability to function independently. At the time of release, Walker was 67 years old, severely debilitated, and no longer posed a risk of organized violence, though the moral and emotional weight of his crimes remained. Walker spent the remainder of his life in a care facility in North Lanarkshire, where he lived quietly and largely out of the public eye. His death in 2021 marked the final chapter in a life that had begun with military service and ended with infamy. Throughout his later years, he never returned to the Pentland Hills to retrieve the buried payroll, leaving the mystery unresolved. The location of the £19,000 remains unknown, buried somewhere in the Scottish wilderness, a hidden relic of one of the country's most shocking post-war crimes. The legacy of the Glencorse Massacre extended far beyond Walker's imprisonment. For the families of the victims, the emotional toll was immense. Major David Cunningham's widow and extended family lived with the trauma of his violent death, as did the families of Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers and Private John Thompson. The public, too, remained fascinated by the case, partly due to the unusual combination of military involvement, premeditated violence, and unresolved financial motive. It became a cautionary tale illustrating the dangers of insider access, the potential for financial desperation to escalate into lethal violence, and the vulnerability of procedural routines when exploited by a determined criminal. In military circles, the massacre led to a re-evaluation of internal security protocols. Payroll transport procedures were revised to include variable routes, staggered timings, and enhanced oversight. Soldiers were trained to recognize the potential risks of insider threats, and systems were introduced to monitor access to firearms more rigorously. The events of January 17, 1985, became a case study in military academies and law enforcement training programs, illustrating both investigative methodology and preventive measures. Walker's case also contributed to the development of forensic ballistics as a field in Scotland. The precision with which investigators matched bullets to Walker's Sterling submachine gun demonstrated the utility of microscopic striation analysis, firing pin identification, and other techniques. These methods would go on to play a role in solving subsequent violent crimes, establishing precedents for linking suspects to weapons through physical evidence rather than circumstantial indicators alone. Even after his death, Walker remained a subject of interest. Documentaries, books, and investigative articles explored both his life and the crime, examining his motives, methodology, and the wider context of Scotland in the 1980s. Analysts noted the intersection of social pressures, military culture, and individual pathology in understanding why someone like Walker could commit such a calculated and violent act. The unresolved fate of the stolen payroll continues to intrigue treasure hunters and amateur sleuths, though the likelihood of recovery diminishes with each passing year. The Glencorse Massacre left an indelible mark on Scotland, particularly in Midlothian and the surrounding Pentland Hills region. News of the murders spread quickly, not only because of the brutality of the crime but also due to the involvement of trained soldiers and the apparent audacity of the perpetrator. The story dominated headlines for weeks, as the public grappled with the shock that one of their own, a former military officer and firearms instructor, had executed a premeditated act of violence against colleagues and friends. For the local community, the event was incomprehensible. The Pentland Hills area had long been known for its serene landscape, remote farming communities, and outdoor recreation. Incidents of violent crime were exceedingly rare, making the Glencorse murders even more terrifying. Farmers, hikers, and residents of nearby villages recalled the winter morning when the discovery of the Land Rover, drenched in blood, shattered the illusion of safety. The image of 3 men, brutally executed and left in a derelict cottage, lingered in the public imagination, fueling speculation and fear. In the days following the massacre, police established a large cordon around the area, interviewing residents, workers at the Glenna Barracks, and anyone who might have witnessed unusual activity. Witness statements provided vital clues, including sightings of Walker in military uniform near the crime scene and the report of 4 men in the Land Rover before the killings. These accounts helped investigators piece together the timeline of events, even as rumors swirled that the Irish Republican Army, IRA, might have been involved. The IRA had been responsible for numerous attacks across the United Kingdom, and at first, it seemed plausible that the killings might fit their modus operandi. However, ballistic evidence and the lack of any claim of responsibility quickly pointed authorities toward a domestic, personal motive. Public interest in the case was intense. Newspapers chronicled the lives of the victims, humanizing them and emphasizing the senseless nature of their deaths. Major David Cunningham, aged 56, was remembered for his dedication to military service and his transition to civilian paymaster duties at the barracks. Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers, 39, was celebrated for his international service and generosity in swapping postings to assist colleagues. Private John Thompson, only 25, was newly arrived at Glencorse, eager to prove himself, and had been on his first payroll run. The loss of these 3 men resonated across Scotland, particularly within military communities, highlighting the vulnerability of even trained personnel when faced with betrayal from within. The families of the victims faced extraordinary challenges in the aftermath. Grieving the deaths of loved ones under such violent circumstances was, in the months following the Glencorse Massacre, the story captivated not just Scotland, but the wider United Kingdom. Newspapers, radio stations, and television channels all reported extensively on the gruesome killings of Major David Cunningham, Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers, and Private John Thompson. The public's fascination was fueled by the juxtaposition of military discipline and the shocking betrayal of one of its own. The image of the blood-soaked Land Rover abandoned in the snow, alongside the brutal execution-style deaths, became symbolic of both the vulnerability of those sworn to protect and the depth of human greed. Journalists meticulously detailed every facet of the case, from Walker's financial debts to his tours in Northern Ireland, where he had been exposed to the violence of conflict zones. Public interest was so intense that reporters often visited the Pentland Hills to capture the icy terrain and isolated cottages, emphasizing how easily someone with insider knowledge could manipulate the familiar environment to commit a crime. The media also highlighted the ongoing investigation, giving prominence to the forensic work that ultimately linked Walker to the murders. Ballistic analysis, comparing the bullets found at the crime scene to the submachine gun Walker had borrowed from the barracks armory, was featured in newspapers and became a talking point in discussions about the emerging role of forensic science in criminal justice. While media coverage brought attention to the bravery of the police and investigators, it also created pressure on them to solve the case quickly. Detectives worked tirelessly, cross-referencing witness statements, army logs, and weapon checkout sheets. The discovery that Walker had been absent without leave and had access to a submachine gun placed him under immediate scrutiny. Interviews with fellow soldiers revealed a complex portrait of a man whose outward demeanor of competence masked a pattern of reckless behavior, financial instability, and, ultimately, dangerous intent. These revelations created a sense of both horror and betrayal among military personnel, some of whom knew Walker personally. The press also followed the human side of the tragedy, reporting on the families of the victims. In particular, they documented the grief of the widows, parents, and siblings left behind, emphasizing the personal cost of the crime beyond its public and historical significance. Stories recounted the daily struggles faced by the families, including the difficulty of returning to normal life, attending memorial services, and coping with the constant media attention. For the communities surrounding Glenna Barracks and the Pentland Hills, these reports reinforced the impact of the massacre on everyday life, from lingering fear while traveling rural roads to cautious observation of any unfamiliar activity in the area. Amid this media frenzy, one mystery captivated the public imagination more than any other: the missing £19,000 payroll. While Walker had meticulously planned the murders to obtain the cash, the money was never recovered. Law enforcement conducted extensive searches in the Pentland Hills, focusing on remote areas near the site of the abandoned Land Rover, as well as along the route of the payroll run. Yet despite these efforts, no trace of the stolen funds was ever found. Speculation flourished, with some suggesting that Walker had hidden the money underground, intending to retrieve it after establishing an alibi. Others theorized he may have spent it surreptitiously on luxury items or gambling, though no evidence confirmed such purchases. The unresolved nature of the payroll's disappearance contributed to the story's enduring notoriety, transforming it from a crime into a legend within local folklore and criminal history circles. Walker's time in prison became a further focal point of interest. Initially incarcerated at Peterhead Prison on Scotland's northeast coast, Walker faced a challenging environment. The prison was overcrowded, and many inmates were resentful of long sentences, especially those serving far from home. Walker's violent tendencies soon manifested within the facility. In 1987, he allegedly orchestrated a riot, coordinating the assault of Officer Bill Florence and the hostage-taking of Officer Jackie Stewart. Over 5 days, Walker and a group of roughly 50 inmates held Stewart without food or water, beating him and parading him across the prison roof while threatening further violence. The situation only ended when the elite SAS intervened in a surprise assault, restoring order and subduing the prisoners. Walker's role in the riot led to an additional 9-year sentence, cementing his reputation as both a murderer and a manipulative, dangerous individual within correctional institutions. Prison psychologists and criminologists studied Walker's behavior extensively. His actions suggested a blend of opportunistic greed, manipulative intelligence, and a lack of remorse that aligned with traits commonly associated with psychopathy. Despite decades of incarceration, he reportedly continued to exert influence over fellow inmates, demonstrating strategic thinking and an ability to coordinate complex actions. Analysts speculated that these behaviors reflected not only his personal disposition, but also the residual effects of exposure to high-stress environments during military service, particularly his tours in Northern Ireland. Walker's case became a reference point for both behavioral studies and criminal psychology within Scotland, illustrating how individuals with access to weapons, insider knowledge, and personal desperation could present ongoing threats even in controlled environments. Throughout his incarceration, Walker maintained a public silence regarding the location of the stolen £19,000. Investigators, journalists, and amateur treasure hunters continued to speculate about whether the funds had been buried in the Pentland Hills, spent secretly, or lost entirely. Some searches incorporated metal detection and ground-penetrating radar to identify potential hiding places, though no conclusive results emerged. The unresolved nature of the money contributed to the narrative of Walker as a figure who had not only committed a heinous crime but also left a tangible mystery that continues to intrigue and frustrate authorities and the public alike. While Walker's imprisonment removed the immediate physical threat, the emotional and procedural repercussions of the massacre persisted. The British Army implemented a series of reforms designed to prevent similar insider attacks. These included stricter controls over firearm access, more varied and less predictable payroll schedules, and enhanced monitoring of soldiers' financial situations. Training programs emphasized situational awareness and the potential for insider threats, aiming to reduce the risk posed by individuals with both motive and opportunity. The Glencorse Massacre became a cautionary tale within military education, demonstrating how procedural oversight, predictable routines, and unmonitored personal vulnerabilities could converge into catastrophic outcomes. Community memory of the massacre remained vivid. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, families, local residents, and former military personnel shared stories of the event, ensuring that its lessons were not forgotten. Memorials were erected to honor the victims, providing spaces for reflection and remembrance. The impact on the psyche of those living and working near the Pentland Hills was profound. Some reported feeling unease when traveling the rural roads where the murders had occurred, while others avoided the area entirely, fearing a repeat of violence. The massacre reshaped perceptions of safety and trust, both within military circles and the broader community, illustrating the long-lasting social consequences of a single, calculated act of violence. Internationally, the Glencorse Massacre gained attention from criminologists, military strategists, and forensic experts. Its unique combination of insider knowledge, premeditated planning, and financial motivation distinguished it from typical violent crimes. Case studies examined Walker's behavioral patterns, the security vulnerabilities he exploited, and the forensic techniques used to link him to the murders. Law enforcement agencies noted the importance of ballistic analysis, witness corroboration, and procedural audits in solving the case, emphasizing how these methods could be applied to other complex investigations. The massacre's notoriety extended beyond Scotland, becoming part of broader discussions on military discipline, insider threats, and forensic advancements. As the 21st century approached, Walker's condition deteriorated due to a stroke he suffered in 2009, leaving him severely disabled. In 2012, he was released on compassionate grounds, spending his remaining years in a care facility in North Lanarkshire. He lived quietly, largely removed from public view, until his death in 2021 at the age of 67. Despite decades of incarceration and the severity of his crimes, Walker never disclosed the location of the stolen payroll. The mystery of a £19,000 remains unsolved, a lingering testament to the audacity and calculation that defined the Glencorse Massacre. The massacre continues to resonate in discussions of Scottish criminal history. It highlights the intersection of personal desperation, insider access, and calculated violence. It underscores the importance of procedural oversight in military and institutional contexts. It also serves as a reminder of the enduring human impact of violent crime. Families left grieving, communities left fearful, and professionals left to grapple with the challenges of justice, prevention, and memory. Even decades after the murders, the Glencorse Massacre remains a point of reference for military historians, forensic investigators, and criminologists. It has been cited in studies examining the psychology of insider threats, the role of firearms access in violent crime, and the impact of unresolved criminal mysteries on communities. The case demonstrates how one individual's actions can reverberate far beyond the immediate victims, influencing policy, practice, and public perception for generations. The story of Walker, the three victims, and the missing payroll is a stark reminder of the capacity for betrayal and greed to overcome trust and duty. It is also a lesson in vigilance. Procedural routines that seem mundane or predictable can be exploited by individuals with the knowledge, intent, and opportunity to commit crimes of devastating impact. In many ways, the Glencorse Massacre serves as both a historical cautionary tale and a continuing mystery, with the unresolved £19,000 symbolizing the tangible consequences of human greed and planning. Decades after the Glencorse Massacre, the Pentland Hills region remained haunted by the memory of that bitter January morning in 1985. The story of Major David Cunningham, Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers, and Private John Thompson, executed in cold blood by a trusted colleague, became a touchstone for discussions about trust, vigilance, and human greed. Locals, even those who were children at the time, often recalled the shockwaves that rippled through their community, the horror of imagining a neighbor, or someone from the barracks, capable of such violence. The icy roads where the Land Rover slid into a ditch remained a silent reminder of the event, a place of memory both feared and respected. Community memory was carefully preserved by local historians and families of the victims. Memorial services were held annually, often attended by military personnel, local residents, and members of the press. Flowers and photographs adorned the steps of Loganley Cottage, where the bodies had been discovered, ensuring that the human cost of Walker's actions was never forgotten. These memorials became spaces not just of grief, but of reflection as families, soldiers, and civilians grappled with questions about duty, loyalty, and the fragility of trust. Teachers and local history societies included the massacre in their discussions of contemporary Scottish history, emphasizing the lessons learned from the tragedy, the dangers of predictable routines, the consequences of ignoring financial and personal stress among personnel, and the power of forensic science to bring even well-planned crimes to justice. Meanwhile, the mystery of the missing £19,000 continued to captivate the imagination of treasure hunters, former soldiers, and local enthusiasts. Despite extensive searches conducted by law enforcement in the years following the murders, the money was never recovered. Metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar were deployed across the Pentland Hills, and small-scale excavations were conducted near likely hiding spots along the payroll route. Some amateur historians and investigators speculated that Walker may have buried the cash under the snow-covered soil, hidden in one of the small caves or crevices that dotted the hills. Others suggested that he might have spent portions of the money quietly on gambling or illicit purchases, though no evidence of such transactions was ever confirmed. The unresolved nature of the funds lent the story a lasting aura of mystery, ensuring that the Glencorse Massacre remained a topic of fascination far beyond its immediate historical and criminal significance. Walker's reputation, both inside and outside prison, became emblematic of calculated human malevolence. Among inmates, he was known for his strategic thinking and ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. His involvement in the 1987 prison riot at Peterhead Prison cemented his notoriety. The takeover, lasting 5 days, showcased Walker's ability to organize and influence a large group of prisoners, turning a desperate and violent situation into a coordinated challenge to authority. Observers noted his tactical use of fear, negotiation, and intimidation, and psychologists studying the event later described Walker as demonstrating traits consistent with high-functioning psychopathy. Even after his release on compassionate grounds in 2012, Walker remained a figure shrouded in infamy. Living quietly in a care home in North Lanarkshire until his death in 2021, he never admitted guilt beyond what had been legally established, nor did he ever reveal the location of the missing payroll. The Glencorse Massacre also left a lasting mark on military procedures in Scotland and across the UK. The army implemented stricter protocols regarding the handling of firearms, cash, and sensitive operations. Payroll schedules became less predictable, varying in both timing and routing to minimize the risk of robbery or ambush. Soldiers were educated on the potential for insider threats, learning that the most dangerous individuals might not be unknown adversaries, but colleagues whose desperation, grievances, or financial difficulties could drive them to violence. Forensic science, particularly ballistics analysis, became an even more central tool in military criminal investigations. The detailed comparison of bullets, casings, and firearm markings that had identified Walker as the perpetrator set a precedent for future cases, illustrating the importance of meticulous evidence collection and analysis in solving complex crimes. Journalists, criminologists, and military historians continued to revisit the case throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Documentaries highlighted not only the crime itself but also its broader implications. The massacre was frequently cited as a turning point in the way military payrolls were managed, demonstrating that procedural predictability could have deadly consequences. Analysts noted that the case served as a cautionary tale for other organizations handling cash, weapons, or sensitive operations. Even the most routine procedures could be exploited by individuals with insider knowledge and malicious intent. Local folklore also absorbed elements of the massacre, transforming it into a story told to new generations as both history and warning. Children growing up in the Pentland Hills often heard whispers of the blood trail in the snow and the cottage of the dead, blending fact and narrative to convey lessons about vigilance and the potential for betrayal. Older residents recounted the event as a time when the familiar became dangerous and predictable routines could not be taken for granted. These stories were not sensationalized to the point of fabrication. Rather, they emphasized the real human cost and the psychological impact of Walker's crime on the community. The unanswered questions surrounding the missing £19,000 continued to inspire speculation. Amateur sleuths and local treasure hunters occasionally reported hearing rumors of someone attempting to retrieve the hidden funds or of secret maps passed down by those with connections to the original case. Some theories suggested that Walker may have confided in a trusted friend or family member about the location of the money. Though no credible evidence ever emerged, police records show that investigations into potential caches were sporadically revisited, particularly following Walker's release, but these searches were never fruitful. The unresolved nature of the cache gave the story a sense of lingering injustice. While the killer had been caught and punished, a tangible symbol of the crime's motivation remained elusive, a ghostly reminder of human greed and premeditated violence. Psychologists and criminologists studying the case emphasized the interplay of personal desperation, access to lethal weapons, and strategic opportunity. Walker's financial debts, combined with his military training and knowledge of standard procedures, created a perfect storm that led to the massacre. His ability to plan meticulously, anticipate responses, and exploit the predictability of routines demonstrated the calculated nature of his actions. Case studies later explored how similar dynamics could manifest in civilian and institutional settings, from corporate fraud to insider threats in government or security services. The Glencorse Massacre became an illustrative example in textbooks, lectures, and seminars examining behavioral patterns of premeditated violence, showing how individuals with knowledge, skill, and motive could commit acts with devastating consequences. The community's response over time highlighted the broader social consequences of violent crime. Families of the victims remained involved in memorials and educational initiatives, ensuring that the lessons of 1985 were not forgotten. Former soldiers who had served alongside Cunningham, Hoskers, and Thompson frequently attended commemorative events, sharing first-hand accounts of the victims' character and professionalism. These narratives reinforced the human dimension of the tragedy, ensuring that the story was not reduced solely to its criminal or forensic elements. Even in 2020, over 35 years after the murders, discussions about the Glencorse Massacre persisted in both academic and popular contexts. Podcasts, documentaries, and history forums revisited the events, analyzing Walker's motives, the forensic breakthroughs, and the community impact. Experts debated hypothetical scenarios, including alternate outcomes if the payroll had been secured differently, if the Army had implemented more rigorous oversight, or if Walker's psychological warning signs had been recognized earlier. These discussions demonstrated the enduring relevance of the case, not only as a historical event but also as a lens through which to examine human behavior, institutional vulnerability, and the interplay between opportunity and intent. Ultimately, the Glencorse Massacre serves as a multifaceted historical event. It is a story of betrayal and violence, illustrating how desperation can drive individuals to commit unimaginable acts. It is a story of justice, showing the role of forensic science, careful investigation, and legal proceedings in holding perpetrators accountable. It is a story of loss and remembrance, highlighting the impact of crime on families, communities, and institutions. And it is a story of mystery, as the missing £19,000 remains an unresolved thread, symbolizing the enduring consequences of human greed and calculated violence. For those who live in the Pentland Hills or have connections to Glenbarracks, the massacre is more than history. It is a reminder of the vulnerability inherent in predictable routines, the importance of vigilance, and the moral responsibility of individuals within tightly knit communities. The story of Walker, the three victims, and the hidden payroll continues to resonate as a cautionary tale for future generations, embodying lessons about trust, procedure, and the enduring effects of violence on both human and institutional memory. Even decades later, the Glencorse Massacre remains a reference point in discussions about military procedures, forensic advancements, criminal psychology, and community resilience. Its legacy endures not because the story has been sensationalized, but because it represents the intersection of ordinary lives, extraordinary betrayal, and the enduring human fascination with unresolved mysteries. By the early 2000s, the Glencorse Massacre had become more than just a headline from January 1985. It had evolved into a symbol of human greed, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked desperation. Andrew Walker, the man responsible for the brutal murders of Major David Cunningham, Staff Sergeant Terry Hoskers, and Private John Thompson, had by then already spent nearly 2 decades in prison. His reputation as a cold, calculating figure had solidified not only among his fellow inmates but also among the public, law enforcement, and the military community. Yet despite decades of imprisonment, there remained an unsettling sense of unfinished business, the missing £19,000 and the questions surrounding Walker's true motivations. Walker's life after incarceration mirrored the dark efficiency with which he had planned the massacre. At Peterhead Prison, he adapted quickly to the harsh environment, demonstrating both strategic thinking and a willingness to manipulate those around him. The 1987 Dare Hall prison riot, where 50 inmates took control and held officers hostage, underscored his ability to command and influence a group even within a highly controlled environment. Psychologists who later studied the incident described Walker as exhibiting traits of high-functioning psychopathy. He was manipulative, calculating, and unflinching in the face of human suffering, yet capable of careful planning and tactical foresight. While the immediate threat was neutralized by the elite SAS, the event left an indelible mark on the British prison system, leading to stricter supervision, more rigorous security protocols, and a renewed emphasis on intelligence gathering among inmate populations. Despite the notoriety he had accumulated behind bars, Walker's personal life remained largely private. He suffered a severe stroke in 2009, which left him partially disabled and dependent on care. In 2012, citing compassionate grounds, authorities released him early, recognizing that his health would require constant medical attention. He spent the final years of his life in a care home in North Lanarkshire, isolated from the places where his crimes had been committed and from the hills where he had buried the elusive payroll. Walker died in 2021 at the age of 67, never having revealed the location of the £19,000, a tangible reminder of his crimes that remained lost to history. The unrecovered payroll became almost mythic over time, discussed in military history forums, local legends, and criminal case studies. Researchers and amateur historians speculated endlessly about its location. Some argued that Walker had buried the canvas bag in one of the hidden gullies or caves in the Pentland Hills, intending to return for it once he was free. Others proposed that he might have spent it quietly, perhaps investing in cars, gambling, or other secretive transactions. While no evidence supported these theories, the story of the missing cash reinforced the enduring mystery surrounding the massacre and served as a tangible symbol of human greed's destructive potential. The unresolved nature of the £19,000 highlighted a grim reality. Even when justice is served through law and punishment, the tangible remnants of crime, money, secrets, and stolen lives can remain unresolved, haunting communities for decades. The families of the victims continued to honor their memory, often attending commemorative services, placing flowers at Loganley Cottage, and sharing stories with younger generations. Major Cunningham, Staff Sergeant Hoskers, and Private Thompson were remembered not just for the tragic circumstances of their deaths, but also for their professionalism, dedication, and the humanity they exhibited throughout their service. Their colleagues frequently recounted stories of bravery, commitment, and camaraderie, ensuring that the narrative did not solely focus on the violence of Walker's actions, but also on the lives of those he destroyed. These stories became crucial in shaping community memory, ensuring that the victims were not reduced to mere names in a criminal record. The massacre also influenced military policy and procedure in tangible ways. Following the incident, British Army barracks across Scotland reviewed their protocols for transporting cash and other sensitive materials. Payroll schedules were altered to include randomized routes and times, and additional oversight measures were introduced to reduce the risk of insider threats. Soldiers were trained to recognize warning signs among colleagues, including behavioral changes, financial stress, and disciplinary issues. The case became a central example in military training programs focusing on risk assessment, internal security, and procedural flexibility, demonstrating that even experienced personnel could fall victim to someone they trusted. Criminal investigators and forensic scientists also looked to the Glencorse Massacre as a pivotal case study. The use of ballistics to match bullets to Walker's submachine gun illustrated the power of meticulous forensic work in solving crimes. Each bullet's striation pattern, combined with firing pin marks on the shell casings, became textbook examples in criminal investigation courses. The case demonstrated that even a well-planned crime, committed by someone with insider knowledge and tactical training, could be unraveled by careful attention to detail, rigorous analysis, and persistent detective work. Forensic experts often cited the massacre in lectures and seminars as a landmark case demonstrating the intersection of human psychology, military procedure, and scientific investigation. Locally, the Glencorse Massacre continued to influence cultural memory. Over time, the story became woven into community identity, serving as a cautionary tale about trust, human ambition, and the unpredictable consequences of crime. Residents spoke of the blood trail in the snow as more than legend. It was a reminder that ordinary routines could have deadly vulnerabilities. Teachers used the event as a historical case study, not to sensationalize, but to teach lessons about vigilance, procedure, and ethical responsibility. Historians emphasize the massacre's significance in illustrating how individual actions can ripple outward, affecting families, communities, and institutions in ways that persist long after the initial crime. Over the years, media portrayals and documentaries helped preserve the story for wider audiences. The narrative of three men murdered by someone they trusted, the careful premeditation of the crime, the unresolved £19,000, and Walker's later years formed a compelling, cautionary tale that transcended Scotland's borders. For many viewers and readers, the Glencorse Massacre highlighted not only the cruelty of one man, but also the resilience of a community determined to remember, honor, and learn from the past. The massacre was cited in criminology journals, military studies, and ethical discussions about the dangers of predictable routines, illustrating the universal lessons embedded within a local tragedy. Walker's death in 2021 closed the chapter on his personal story, but it did not end the legacy of the massacre. Researchers and historians continued to analyze the event, exploring questions about motive, planning, and opportunity. The psychological dimensions of Walker's behavior, combined with the institutional vulnerabilities he exploited, became a focal point for discussions about preventive measures and early warning signs. Communities across Scotland and the UK studied the case as a model of both criminal ingenuity and the enduring importance of procedural safeguards, ensuring that future generations could learn from the mistakes and oversights of the past. The unresolved £19,000 continues to serve as a tangible reminder of the tragedy. Treasure hunters occasionally explore the Pentland Hills, combing through gullies, caves, and snow-covered fields in the hope of discovering the hidden cache. While official searches have yielded no results, the legend persists, reflecting the human fascination with mystery, wealth, and unfinished narratives. The story reminds both locals and historians that some aspects of human behavior, particularly greed and desperation, can leave enduring traces that remain hidden, elusive, and compelling decades after the initial events. Ultimately, the Glencorse Massacre is remembered as a story with many layers, a story of three men whose lives were brutally cut short, a story of calculated criminal intent, a story of forensic triumph, and a story of community resilience. It is a historical case that demonstrates the devastating consequences of insider betrayal, the importance of vigilance in both military and civilian life, and the enduring human fascination with unresolved mysteries. For the families, the victims are immortalized not just in memorials or documentaries but in the ongoing discussions about ethics, procedure, and trust. The Pentland Hills remain a quiet, scenic region, seemingly untouched by the violence of 1985. Yet for those who know the history, every snow-covered path and hidden gully carries echoes of the past. Logan Lee Cottage, where the bodies were discovered, stands as a solemn monument to the lives lost and the lessons learned. The massacre is a reminder that ordinary routines can be perilous when combined with desperation, opportunity, and human malice. As the final chapter in this story, the Glencorse Massacre underscores the enduring relevance of historical investigation, forensic science, and community memory. While justice was served through Walker's conviction and imprisonment, the narrative remains incomplete in the eyes of those who remember the missing payroll, the unanswered questions, and the human stories behind the tragedy. The massacre teaches that crime, though punishable, leaves traces that resonate long after the courtroom has closed and the perpetrators have passed from the world. Walker's life ended in obscurity, but the event he orchestrated continues to teach lessons about human nature, institutional vulnerability, and the importance of ethical vigilance. From memorial services to forensic seminars, from local folklore to academic discussions, the Glencorse Massacre serves as a stark reminder: ordinary people, living ordinary lives, can fall victim to extraordinary cruelty, and yet communities, institutions, and justice systems can endure, learn, and adapt. Even decades later, the story captivates because it embodies the full spectrum of human behavior: loyalty, bravery, desperation, greed, cunning, and cruelty within a single, tragic event. And while the £19,000 remains lost, perhaps the true legacy of the massacre lies not in the missing money, but in the lessons it provides about vigilance, justice, and the enduring strength of human memory. The Glencorse Massacre, though firmly rooted in the history of Midlothian, Scotland, transcends its geographical and temporal confines. It is a story of life, death, and human consequence, a story that will continue to echo for generations, compelling us to reflect on the fragility of trust and the enduring consequences of violence.